Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. The author, rahimahullah, now is going to go on to talk about those things that nullify the prayer. Babu mufsidat salati. Those things that nullify the prayer. So that when a person is praying the prayer and one of these things occur during the prayer, then this is going to nullify or invalidate the prayer, meaning that a person will have to repeat the prayer completely because it has become nullified due to one of these actions. And so he mentions وَتَفْسُدُ الصَّلَاةُ بِالضَّحِكِ عَمْدًا أَوْ سَهْوًا. The first thing that he mentions is that laughing nullifies the prayer, whether it's done عَمْدًا أَوْ سَهْوًا, whether it's done intentionally or whether it's done out of forgetfulness. Now, something here that we have to pay attention to is the rulings of things sometimes change between when the thing is done intentionally and when the thing is done out of forgetfulness. And so in some rulings that we're going to mention, we'll see that whether a person does it intentionally or does it out of forgetfulness, the ruling is the same. Whereas in some of the rulings that we will mention, if the action will only become nullified or it will invalidate the prayer if the action is done intentionally, but not if it is done out of forgetfulness. So here, the first one here that he mentions is laughing. And so the reason why he mentions amdan or sahwan, whether intentionally or sahwan, to clarify that regardless of how it happens, as long as a person laughs, his prayer will be nullified. So that's the first one. The next one he mentions will be sujud sahwi lil fadilati, and making a sujud sahwi because of a fadila. Meaning, if a person were to make a sajda, a prostration out of forgetfulness for forgetting a fadila, only missing a fadila, then his prayer would be considered invalid. And the reason for that is because missing a fadila does not necessitate that a person make a sajda for forgetfulness. And so making a sajda for forgetfulness is like adding something to your prayer. And adding something to your prayer that doesn't belong nullifies the prayer. Now, this will be clarified more in the next section when we cover sajda sahu, so hold on to the thought and the idea. Another thing that I want to bring to light is that we just mentioned that doing something intentionally and doing something out of forgetfulness are, in some cases, if they are done regardless of whether it's done intentionally or out of forgetfulness, the hukm is the same. And sometimes when it is only done out of forgetfulness, then the hukm is not the same. So we have two issues: we have doing an act intentionally, and we have doing an act out of forgetfulness. There is a third one that's not mentioned, but it's in this text, but it's intended. And that is doing something out of ignorance. Doing something out of ignorance, we say there's a general rule that doing something out of ignorance is like doing something intentionally. What does that mean? It means that because this knowledge is fard ayn, meaning because this knowledge is obligatory to know for every responsible Muslim, then doing an action out of ignorance is like doing it intentionally, because doing it out of ignorance when is as if a person did it intentionally, because although that person was obligated to learn and to know these things, they gave up learning it, or they did not take the time to learn it, and so their ignorance is like doing it intentionally. So when he says bi sujud sahwi lil fadilati, making a sajda for the sake of a fadila is doing something out of ignorance, because a person assumed, oh, I missed the fadila, then maybe it's like a fard, and so I have to make sajda before salam. So in reality, make a note here that when he says making sajda for the sake of a fadila, it's as if it means that he's doing it out of ignorance, and ignorance is like doing it intentionally, and so it nullifies the prayer. All right. So that's what he says, will be sujud sahwi lil fadilati. So we should make a point here that if a person were to do it out of forgetfulness, meaning that a person just did it out of forgetfulness, but he knew the ruling, it wouldn't nullify the prayer. But we'll get more into detail in the next section when we talk about making sujood, the prostration of forgetfulness. Then he moves into the next one, وَبِالتَّعَمُّدِ زِيَادَةِ رَكْعَةٍ أَوْ سَجْدَةٍ أَوْ نَحْوِ ذَلِكَ فِي الصَّلَاةِ. Or intending, the next thing that nullifies the prayer is intentionally increasing a rak'ah or a sajda or anything like that in prayer. In short, what he's saying is the intentionally increasing an obligatory act. That's what he means, because he mentions rak'ah and he mentions sajda or anything like that. Both of the things that he mentioned are obligatory acts. In short, what he means is increasing an obligatory act in prayer intentionally nullifies the prayer. And the reason, pay attention, the reason why he uses the word intentionally, because if he was to do it out of forgetfulness, then it wouldn't nullify the prayer. And as I mentioned before, more detail will be given in that in the next section. Then he says, وَبِالْأَكْلِ وَالشُّرْبِ وَبِالْكَلَامِ عَمْدًا. And eating and drinking, meaning eating or drinking or kalam or speaking in prayer intentionally, nullifies the prayer. The reason why I mentions nullify the prayer, because if a person were to do it out of forgetfulness, then his prayer wouldn't be considered invalid, unless in terms of eating and drinking and speaking, he did it a lot. So for example, if a person out of forgetfulness did one of these actions for a small second or a split second, then it would be overlooked. But if you were to do it for a long period of time, then his prayer would be nullified. But if he did it intentionally, then regardless of whether it's little or a lot, then his prayer would be nullified. But he says إِلَّا لِإِصْلَاحِ الصَّلَاةِ. Now in terms of speaking intentionally, as we mentioned, will nullify prayer, except in the case when a person is doing it in order إِلَّا لِإِصْلَاحِ الصَّلَاةِ, in order to correct something in prayer. For example, when the imam makes a mistake and everybody says subhanallah, saying subhanallah is for the sake of correcting the prayer. So for this reason, although he's speaking intentionally, it doesn't nullify his prayer, because here he has a permission for the Sharia, a permission from the Sharia in order to speak during his prayer. Secondly, another example would be, let's say the imam, after finishing his prayer, he said assalamu alaikum, and the followers before him knew that he missed something of his prayer, and so they continued adding a rak'ah, or they waited for the imam to see if he forgot something. If he remembered that he forgot something. So the imam turned around to them and said, did I forget a rak'ah, for example? It would be permissible for a person to say, yes, you did. But he cannot speak any more than what he needs in order for the imam to understand him. For example, if the imam said, yes, I did. If the imam was to ask, did I miss something? And the person said, yes, I did. Yes, you did. Then it is not if that person were to speak any more than that, then his prayer would be invalid. So the permission of speaking for the sake of correcting his prayer is only enough that is needed in order for the imam to understand. And that's why he mentions right after, فَطَبْتُلُوا بِكَثِيرِهِ دُونَ يَسِيرِهِ. But the prayer will become nullified, or will be considered, it will be nullified if بِكَثِيرِهِ, with a lot of speech, لِإِصْلَاحِ الصَّلَاةِ. So if a person was correcting the imam, as I mentioned, if he spoke a lot, then it would nullify his prayer. But if he only spoke little, then it wouldn't nullify his prayer. Then the next one is بِالنَّفْخِ amdan, blowing out of the mouth amdan. So for example, if a person were to blow, like what a person does when they're hot. For example, you're in the prayer and you go, and the imam was reciting along and you said, for example, you breathed out like that. According to the ulama, they would say if that was done intentionally, then it would nullify the prayer, because it's like speech. So there's a qiyas here, there's an analogy being made here, that it's, if a person is doing it intentionally, then it's like speech. And the reason why I mentions intentionally, because if it was done out of forgetfulness, then it wouldn't nullify the prayer. Then he says wabil hadath. Wabil hadath means by nullifying one's wudu. So if a person was to nullify their wudu in prayer, then obviously, as everybody knows, that would nullify the prayer. And وَذِكْرِ الْفَائِتَةِ وَذِكْرِ الْفَائِتَةِ, meaning that a prayer will become nullified if a person remembers that the prayer before it, he didn't pray. So for example, let's say a person now is praying Asr, and he realizes that he's praying Dhuhr. He realizes that he didn't pray Dhuhr. For example, the person was sleeping, when a person went to sleep and they woke up, and because they were tired and Asr was in, they just thought, they didn't really recognize that they didn't pray Asr. And so they didn't pray Dhuhr. So now they're praying Asr and they're praying Asr, and during Asr they realize that I didn't pray Dhuhr. Right now their Asr will become invalid because praying your Dhuhr and your Asr in order is obligatory. So that's what he means by بِذِكْرِ الْفَائِتَةِ وَبِالْقَيْءِ إِن تَعَمَّدَهُ. And it is nullified. A person's prayer also becomes nullified if a person vomits intentionally. So for example, a person brings out the vomit intentionally, then their prayer would become invalid, but not if a person was to vomit غلبة unintentionally. So for example, a person was in the masjid, or he ate a lot, for example, and for some reason some food came up and passed his throat without his without him being the cause for it, then his prayer wouldn't be invalid. But if he were to cause himself to vomit, then his prayer would be invalid. Then he mentions وَبِزِيَادَةِ أَرْبَعِ رَكَعَاتٍ سَهْوًا فِي الرُّبَاعِيَّةِ وَالثُّلَاثِيَّةِ. Also, we're going to talk about an issue here of increasing rakahs in your prayer out of forgetfulness. According to the Malikiyah, if you were to increase something if you were to increase rakahs in your prayer, for example, to be more accurate, Dhuhr, Asr, and Maghrib are what we call al-Ruba'iyyah. They're the prayers that consist of 4 rakahs. And the Maghrib is called al-Thulathiyah. So as long as a person does not add 4 rakahs to the Maghrib, Dhuhr, Asr, or Isha prayer, then their prayer will be sound. For example, let's just say I'm praying Dhuhr right now, and at the end of the Dhuhr, I realize that I add 1 rakah. If you add 1 rakah to your prayer and you remember, your prayer won't be invalid. You're going to make a sajda, and we'll talk about that in the next section. But let's just say you forgot 4 times to the point that the point that one of these prayers ended up becoming 8 rakahs. Then we're going to say that although you did it out of forgetfulness, the prayer is invalid because it's as if you prayed the prayer twice. So that's what he means by وَبِزِيَادَةِ أَرْبَعِ رَكَعَاتٍ سَهْوًا فِي الرُّبَاعِيَّةِ وَالثُّلَاثِيَّةِ. Again, so in terms of what we're talking about here is adding an extra rak'ahs to your prayers that consist of 3 rak'ahs or 4 rak'ahs. So whether it's Maghrib, Asr, Isha, or Dhuhr, if a person adds 1 extra rak'ah out of forgetfulness, fine. That will be covered in the bab of sujood sahwi. What you're supposed to do if you add an extra rak'ah by mistake. If you add 2 rak'ahs or you add 3 rak'ahs, fine. But the minute you add 4 rak'ahs, then the prayer becomes invalid. There's no way to correct it. When you miss when you add 1 rak'ah, then in the bab of sujood sahwi, we're going to see that you can correct it. If you add 2, you can correct it. If you add 3, you can correct it. But at the minute you add 4, then the prayer becomes invalid. So that's in terms of the prayers that consist of 3 rakahs or 4 rakahs. So that's the meaning of it saying وَبِزِيَادَةِ أَرْبَعِ رَكَعَاتٍ, with the increase of 4 rakahs, sahwan, out of forgetfulness, in matters concerning فِي الرُّبَاعِيَّةِ وَالثُّلَاثِيَّةِ. Now he's going to talk about the rak'atain, meaning the subh prayer, the morning prayer. If you were to add 2 rak'ahs to the morning prayer out of forgetfulness, then your prayer would be invalid. So if you were to add 1 by accident, no problem. But the minute you add a second extra one, then the prayer becomes invalid, and that's what he means وَبِزِيَادَةِ رَكْعَتَيْنِ فِي الثُّنَائِيَّةِ. Thuna'iyati means the prayers that have 2 rakahs, and obviously we're talking about Salatul Subh. Then he's going to go on to mention will be سجود المسبوق مع الإمام للسهو قبليا أو بعديا إن لم يدرك معه ركعة. This one is very important here and it's very catchy, so pay attention. Understand that when you are praying behind the imam, you are considered a follower. But let's say you come here, the area of this issue of fiqh is, pay attention, is particular to the imam in the last rak'ah. If you were to enter the mosque and the imam, if you were to enter the mosque while the imam was in his fourth rak'ah and he already raised his head up from the last rak'ah, meaning that you didn't catch the prayer with the imam. Meaning either you caught the imam in sujood or you caught the imam in tashahhud. Or you caught the imam while he already completely raised his head from his ruku'. Then in this case, although you're going to join the prayer, technically speaking, you did not catch the imam. So although you're behind him for the last tashahhud, you are not considered a person who's following the imam. So if that imam goes along and makes the sajda, you do not make sajda with him. You're going to stand up and you're going to complete your prayer, because you're not considered a person who is praying behind the imam because you did not catch the prayer with the imam. So if you were to go ahead and make sajda with him, then your prayer would be invalid, because you are like somebody who was praying in a mosque and a person outside of your prayer said make sujood and you went and followed him. It means that you increased something in your prayer intentionally, which is a sajda, and assuming that you were following the imam, but technically speaking you are not following the imam. So that's why he says will be sujood al-masbuki, the sajda of the one who's following the imam, even if he was to do it out of forgetfulness, whether the imam is doing a sajda before salam or after salam, in lam yudrik ma'ahu rak'atan, if that person did not catch the rak'ah with the imam. So understand, if you come to the prayer late, meaning in the fourth rak'ah, and you did not catch the prayer with the imam, and then all of a sudden while you're sitting into tashahhud, the imam goes and makes a sajda after salam, you are not to follow him. You are to stand up and complete your prayer without following him in sujood. If you go into sujood, then you go under the rule of adding something to your prayer out of ignorance, and we said that doing something out of ignorance is like doing it intentionally, so your prayer becomes invalid. And then he's going to mention the next one will be tarki sujud al-qabliy in kana an naqsi thalathi sunanin. According to the Maliki school, which will become clear later, if you miss two sunnahs or you miss one sunnah mu'akkada, you are recommended to make sajda qabla salam. Now let's just say you forgot to make the sajda qabla salam. Let's say you forgot to make the sajda qabla salam and you didn't remember until later on, until you left the masjid. Your prayer will be valid under the case that you didn't miss three sunnahs. So let's just say, for example, you were supposed to make sajda before salam because you missed a sunnah mu'akkada. And all of this will become clear in the next section. And you didn't make that sajda. So let me give you a practical example. In our madhab, making the tashahhud is a sunnah mu'akkada. But let's just say you were in your second rak'ah and you stood up without making your tashahhud. After the prayer, you are requested to make two sajdas, two posturations before the salam, in order to make up for the sunnah, right? But you did not let's say you did not end up making that sajda. You did not end up making that sajda, so you said assalamu alaikum and then you left the mosque. Now that you left the mosque, you realize, oh no, I didn't make the sajda. The reality is here though that you only missed two sunnahs, which was the sitting and the tashahhud. So because you only missed two sunnahs, then your prayer would still be valid, although you didn't forget to although you forgot to make the sajda, but if it happened to be 3 sunnahs that you missed, then your prayer would be considered invalid. So that's what he means by وَبِتَرْكِ السُّجُودِ الْقَبْلِيَّةِ, by not performing the sajda qabliya, if in kana an naqsi thalathi sunan, if that sajda qabliya that you're making was because you ended up missing 3 sunnahs in the prayer, then in this case your prayer would be invalid. Inshallah, for those who don't understand this mas'ala, inshallah it will be clear, because this issue is covered in the section of sujood sahwi, and that is the end of on the section of those things that nullify the prayer. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een.